Welcome, everyone. Hello. My name is Madeline Jarrett. I am the Graduate Research Assistant at the Blasey Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of the Alfred and Melissa de Leonardo lecture series entitled Catholicism Represented, Democracy, Religion, and Global History. Before the main event, I'd like to offer two brief housekeeping items. First, this conversation is going to be recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. So in light of that, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. And secondly, we would like to draw your attention to two exciting upcoming events at the Blasey Center. On Tuesday, March 25th, we will host Janine Hill Fletcher for our inaugural Nancy Marzella lecture on women and American Catholicism. Her lecture, entitled Enslaved to the Jesuits, What Women of the First U.S. Diocese Can Tell Us About Women in the Church, will take place from 5:30 to 7 in Devlin Hall, room 101. And on Wednesday, April 2nd, we will host a panel event for our own Mark Massa's newest book, Catholic Fundamentalism in America. The panel will feature Randall Balmer, M. Kathleen Caveney, Mark Massa, and Jim O'Toole. It will take place from 5:30 to 7, right here in this room, 245 Beacon Street, room 107. To learn more about these and our other events, please visit our website, bc.edu/Blasey. And if you prefer to get your information in trendier ways, you can also follow us on social media. And now I will turn the podium over to the director of the Blasey Center, Mark Massa.
Welcome, everybody, to this. I'm glad to see you on this cold and rainy February day. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of the Al and Missy. I always called her Missy, but I think she goes by Melissa, the Leonardo lecture series on American Catholicism. And the donor is here. Al, take a stand, please. So it's like, thank you, Al. It's a delight to introduce to you John T. McGreevy, who is the Charles and Jill Fisher Provost, and also the Francis A. McEnany. Am I saying that right? Francis A. McEnany, Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. He has served as Provost of UND since 2022. Also at Notre Dame, he served as the I.A. O'Shaughnessy Dean of the College of Arts and Letters from 2008 to 2018. He's the author of 4 books, and I think I can safely say each of them was groundbreaking and very important. The first of these, Parish Boundaries. The subtitle was The Catholic Encounter with Race in the 20th Century Urban North, was reviewed everywhere. I think it was in the New York Times book review. I believe it was. He published another book called Catholicism and American Freedom, A History, which is a book which changed my mind about a whole bunch of things. He published a book called American Jesuits and the World, which I reviewed for, I think, church history. I loved it. He wrote to me and said, "You said too many nice things." I said, "But I believe them too." And most recently, he's published a book called Catholicism, A Global History from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. He has published articles in the Journal of American History, the New York Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement. It's a very long CV, and I'm not going to read it to you. So please join with me, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you John McGreevy. Thank you, John.
Can everyone hear me? It's always a pleasure to visit Boston College. I want to thank my hosts, Father Mark Massa, S.J., and Susan Richard, for their gracious welcome. I'm honored to be the first Al and Melissa de Leonardo lecturer. The quality of the subsequent lectures will go up. I can assure Mr. and Mrs. de Leonardo, but none will be more grateful or honored to be among their number. I want to thank my friend Jim O'Toole in the audience and known as a distinguished historian to everyone in this room. Jim's fellow historian, David Quigley, is in the back, your superlative provost, from whom I have learned a great deal about academic leadership. And she couldn't be here, but I want to thank for the record my former and your current colleague, Kathy Caveney, who has taught us all much about ethics, the law, Catholicism, The Sopranos, and Buffy and the Vampire Slayer. I hope they and all of you chime in with questions. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for conversation and discussion. Okay, question. Should Catholics promote democracy? Remember that question. I'm going to get to it. But before I answer the question of whether or not Catholics should promote democracy, I want to talk about why I wrote this last book that Mark so graciously mentioned, Catholicism, A Global History from the French Revolution to Pope Francis. You can see I'm very proud to have a French translation coming out soon. 2 reasons I wrote the book. First was to make an argument. And that argument is a better understanding of Catholicism enhances our grasp of the modern world. No institution is as multicultural or multilingual. Few touches many people. The Chinese Communist Party, the European Union, the Central Intelligence Agency, the International Monetary Fund, all possess global influence. But only the Catholic Church includes extended networks of people and institutions in Warsaw, Nairobi, and Mexico City, as well as the most remote sections of the Amazon. Only Catholicism counts 1.2 billion baptized members, a majority of whom now are people of color living in the global south. Only a pope, as Francis did when he visited Manila in 2015, can attract 6 million people, arguably the largest crowd in human history, in a driving rainstorm to attend Mass. Historians increasingly recognize this, and one thing we can talk about in the question and answer is why and how there's been such a recent burst of superb scholarship on modern Catholicism, and that scholarship has made this book possible. Placing these books and articles in conversation makes visible similarities that are blurred when studying a single person, a diocese, a parish, or a country. The biggest change in history writing in my lifetime has been the loosening of the clamps of the nation-state. Nation-states matter for the study of modern Catholicism, and I try to suggest this in the book, but people, devotions, and ideas also crossed national borders with surprising ease. The book is not comprehensive. Princeton's David Bell worried a few years ago that the scope of most global histories renders them, quote, incapable of assessing causation or even sustaining a reader's interest, end quote. Suitably chastened, I've made this study as much a story as my narrative skills allow, sacrificing coverage for individuals and themes. Specialists will regret, and a few specialists have regretted in reviews, what is missing, and rightly so. Okay, so the first reason I wrote the book is to convey the importance of Catholicism as a global and modern institution. The second reason I wrote the book, I will admit, is personal. Most of my life, a bit to my amazement, has been spent studying in, teaching in, writing about, and administering Catholic institutions. On an almost daily basis, I get asked, and I wonder, how did we get here? The long sweep of the 19th century Catholic revival, the building of a vast protective milieu of parishes, schools, and associations, schools, by the way, such as Boston College, the political crisis of the 1930s, World War II, decolonization, the Second Vatican Council, the Cold War, the political denouement of 1989, and the sexual abuse crisis, those are the main episodes in the book. Cumulatively, they have resulted in a church marked by unprecedented vibrancy in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, concern for social justice, pretty much everywhere, and global connections. A few years ago, when I was attending Mass with my family in the most remote section of rural Minnesota while we were on vacation, I learned that the priest was a celebrant from southern India. He handed out a typed copy of his homily so that his congregation, all descendants of German and Irish farmers who moved to this region in the 19th century, could decipher his accented English. If we could fly right now to Guangzhou, China, that's the cathedral in Guangzhou right now, which is built by Chinese laborers, but designed by French missionaries in the 19th century, if we could go to Sunday Mass there at noon on this Sunday, Guangzhou time, we would see 2,000 Nigerian Catholic workers fill the entire basilica. Meanwhile, in much of the world, including the United States, the number of observant Catholics is shrinking, even hemorrhaging. The structures, physical and metaphorical, built in the 19th and 20th century barely stand. In 2020 in Ireland, once the source of missionary clergy and nuns for the entire Anglophone world, more bishops, 2, were ordained than priests, 1. The sexual abuse crisis has taken an incalculable toll on survivors above all, but also on the credibility of Catholic institutions and the people who run them. The confidence of an earlier era, the West German magazine Der Spiegel in 1962 explained to its readers that, quote, the Church had achieved a unity and consistency in teaching and structure never before seen, end quote. That confidence is a distant memory. So 2 reasons to write the book. First, to place Catholicism into global history, and second, to advance Catholic self-understanding. So back to the initial question. Should Catholics promote democracy? It might seem obvious to you. It did not seem obvious in 1941. Exiled in New York City as the Wehrmacht occupied France, philosopher Jacques Maritain, Maritain is the guy in the center there. That's him in Warsaw in 1937 talking to other Catholic intellectuals in Warsaw. Maritain, who I think is the most important Catholic intellectual of the 20th century. 1941, he's in New York. He writes to his friend Yves Simon, another French Catholic intellectual who made it out of France just before the Germans invaded France. And he asks Simon, could you go to the Notre Dame Library? I happen to live actually in a house right now that is 7 doors down from where Simon lives. South Bend's a very small town. 7 doors down from where Simon lived. And I think of him walking down the street. Could you go up to the Notre Dame Library, Maritain asked Simon, and could you confirm for me that Thomas Aquinas, the lodestar of so much Catholic thought of the late 19th and mid-20th century, could you confirm for me that Thomas Aquinas, quote, firmly believed that consent of the people is required for the legitimacy of the state. That consent of the people is required for the legitimacy of the state. Simon trundled up to the library, walking down with the lot where my house is now, and he supplied the citation. Bitterly. Both Simon and Maritain knew in 1941 that Catholics around the world had admired Austria's Engelbert Dollfuss, who had dissolved that country's parliament in 1934 in an effort to build a Catholic state. Even more vociferously, Catholics admired this gentleman. Anyone know who this is? It's a tough one. Antonio Salazar, the leader of Portugal for about 40 years, from the 30s to the early 70s. Many Catholics admired Salazar in the 1930s and his efforts to build a Catholic state. Salazar was a fierce critic of both free market economics and parliamentary democracy, frequently quoted Rerum Novarum, but had no interest in democracy within Portugal. In France itself, after the German occupation of the country in 1940, many Catholics, probably a majority, a close majority at least, of Catholic intellectuals had rallied to the banner of the authoritarian Vichy government. So to talk about Catholics and democracy in 1941 seemed to Yves Simon, this is a direct quote, only trash. The antagonism of Catholicism and democracy, Simon wrote back to Maritain, is the problem we are asked to overcome. Our own democratic crisis is, of course, prompting a scholarly outpouring. Investigators devote special attention to times and places where democracies reverted to dictatorships, as in Europe in the 1930s and South America in the 1970s. Harvard political scientists Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in their superb How Democracies Die, confirm the diagnosis made 60 years ago by Maritain and Simon. They observe how in the 1930s a hierarchical Catholicism rested uneasily next to a democratic politics of compromise, negotiation, and uncertain outcomes. Some Catholic leaders, as in Belgium, actively and bravely resisted authoritarianism. Others, as in Austria and Portugal and Brazil and Argentina, welcomed it. Now, in the book, I try to take a longer chronological view. I begin with the French Revolution because I think the towering legacy of the French Revolution, the first democratic revolution, but also in its latter stages deeply anti-Catholic, has blocked from view a more complex history. Many Catholics in the early 19th century, especially in Spain and Latin America, urged democratic and republican governments. After helping draft the first constitution in Spain's history in 1812, many Spanish priests and bishops required it to be read at the end of Sunday Mass. Their peers in Mexico City did the same with the first Mexican constitution in the 1820s. When Alexis de Tocqueville toured the United States in 1831, he identified Catholics as, quote, the most Republican and democratic class in the United States. The equality of believers within Catholicism, de Tocqueville thought, made them unusually sympathetic to small d democratic governments. He rejected the claim that had come out of the French Revolution that the Catholic religion was the natural enemy of democracy. Some of these same Catholics in the early 19th century, arguing for political representation in the political realm, obviously usually educated male elites, also favored representation within the church. Representation within the church, not just the state. They desired voice on the appointment of bishops, and the appointment of bishops in the 19th century was a process controlled by governments, by and large, not controlled by the Vatican. They wanted voice on even the naming of parish priests. In Canada especially, one of the founding figures of Canadian nationalism demanded the placement of lay notables, that is, leading lay figures in individual parishes, on what were then parish councils, so as to avoid, and this phrase is incredible to me, so as to avoid, quote, taxation without representation, end quote. In the mid-19th century, this nascent alliance between Catholicism and democracy within the church, but also more broadly without, collapsed. It unraveled. Pius IX, who became Pope in 1846 and remained as Pope to 1878, retreated into a defensive stance after the revolutions of 1848. The need to defend the church against liberal governments from Germany to Italy to Ecuador, who seemed quite willing, and in fact they were quite willing, to expel priests and nuns from their country or to seize church property, the need to defend the church against those liberal governments seemed the pressing task. We don't need to worry about representation and voice. Remember, even here in Boston, a liberal anti-slavery government led the way in attacks on Catholics in the 1850s, including criticism of the Catholic institutions that morphed into Boston College. The Catholic keywords of the 19th century, I argue in the book, around the world, were authority and justice. The Catholic keywords were authority and justice, not representation or voice. The very term, social justice, which we habitually use, was coined by an Italian Jesuit in 1861. The job of lay people, crudely put, became to obey priests, priests would obey bishops, and everyone would obey a pope who was declared infallible at the First Vatican Council in 1870. Building the milieu of churches, associations, schools, organizations in a hostile world seemed more important than a potentially destructive democratic politics. Now, to be fair, Catholics in Europe and South America did form Catholic political parties defensively in the late 19th century. The German Catholic Party was very famous, and its leader, Ludwig Windthorst, was so popular within the German Catholic milieu in Germany that when German Catholic migrants came to Texas, there's a town called Windthorst there, and when they came to Saskatchewan in Canada, there's a town called Windthorst there. In Anglophone countries especially, Catholics became quite skilled at both local and national politics. One child of Irish Catholic immigrants, this is Al Smith, ran for president as the first Catholic candidate of a national party in 1928. Another child of Irish Catholic migrants, James Scullin, was elected Prime Minister of Australia in 1929. But Catholic theory lagged Catholic practice. When challenged to defend Leo XIII's encyclical advocating for a unity of church and state, Al Smith, right here, famously responded, "What the hell is an encyclical?" A more dominant pattern after World War I was for Catholic intellectuals and politicians to express doubts about democracy's future. Of the 28 European democracies in 1920, there were 13 left by 1940. Democracy weakened or collapsed in every large South American country, including Brazil and Argentina. One of the photos I have in the book is this photo of Christ the Redeemer statue, which is just over the harbor of Rio de Janeiro. It's an incredible thing, right? That crowd in the photo is what interests me. It's a crowd about half, if you zoom in, of politicians, half of bishops and priests together for this religious statue, all of whom, almost all of whom, will go on to support authoritarian governments in Brazil. Democracy was the dog that did not bark in Catholic social thought. Pius XI offered a condescending appraisal of modern democratic states in 1922, which were most exposed to the danger of being overthrown by one faction or another. Catholics were not sympathetic broadly to the Nazi government that came into power in Germany in the 1930s, but they were also willing to negotiate. So this is Eugenio Pacelli at the end, who becomes Pope Pius XII, signing the Concordat between the Vatican and Nazi Germany in 1934 in a failed effort to try and protect Catholic institutions. This was the world that Jacques Maritain, remember him, sought to change. He was really an unlikely reformer. In his career, in the early days, he too had a very little interest in democracy. The more I think about it, he wrote to a friend in 1914, the more I am persuaded that we must have a political doctrine as Catholics, then this doctrine can only be anti-revolutionary, anti-republican, anti-constitutional, and therefore monarchist. But Maritain changed his mind. In the late 20s, he became convinced of the efficacy and morality of democracy. And in his 1936 masterpiece, I don't want you to rush out and read it. It's a bit of an unreadable masterpiece in my judgment, especially when translated from Maritain's meandering French, but it is nonetheless a very important book. Maritain outlined a simultaneously Catholic and democratic vision. He said Catholics should not translate theological categories directly into politics. We had to welcome, as Catholics, pluralism. Democratic governments with universal suffrage, and it's interesting, Maritain was very early on women's suffrage, should be required following this distinction he made between political and religious authority. He traveled everywhere in the tense days of the 1930s promoting this Catholic and democratic vision. I showed you that photo of him in Poland, but he went to Germany, to Canada, to Argentina, to Spain, the United States multiple times. When the war began and he was exiled to the United States, he began writing about the synchronicity, as he saw it, of Catholicism and democracy. It is necessary to remember, he told Yves Simon, their correspondence is published, it's unbelievably rich. It is necessary to remember that St. Thomas Aquinas was a Democrat. In this sense, the gospel works in history in a small d democratic direction. He coordinated a manifesto in the face of the world's crisis. It says, a manifesto by European Catholics sojourning in America, both North and South America, that argued that the crisis of World War II, the battle between the Allies and the Axis, was really a battle about democracy. Maritain's ideas underwrote one of the key achievements of 20th century politics, Christian democratic parties. After the war, and after almost a century of Catholics doubting the efficacy of democracy, at least in Europe and Latin America, Catholics became its guarantors. For all or part of the period between 1945 and 1980, Christian democratic parties held power in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. All Christian democratic parties, all inspired at least broadly by Maritain and this thinking about Catholicism and democracy. Even parties that weren't explicitly Christian democratic, in Uganda, in Indonesia, in Ireland, adopted similar language as they pushed for family allowances, supported trade unions, and urged Catholics to participate in democratic governance. Now, not only Catholics belonged to Christian democratic parties, and they were never controlled by the institutional church. But the lineage from Maritain's writings in the 40s to this Christian democratic explosion in the late 40s that really goes until the 1980s is quite direct. This photo here, these three gentlemen, on the left is Alcide de Gasperi, the long-term president of Italy. In the middle there's Konrad Adenauer, the even longer-term president of Germany, or Chancellor of West Germany. And then on the right there's Robert Schuman, briefly then the Prime Minister of France in the Fourth Republic, but then ultimately, really more than any other single person, the founder of the European Union. All Christian Democrats, all Catholics, all multilingual German, French, Italian speakers, all committed to this Catholic vision. So it's a long list by 1960. It's Maritain, it's Adenauer, it's Schuman, it's Charles de Gaulle, who corresponds with Maritain during the days of World War II. It also includes prime ministers and presidents from outside Western Europe. This is Leopold Senghor, an avid reader of Maritain and Senegal's first president. This is Ngo Dinh Diem, now not much of a Democrat actually, the president of South Vietnam, but who read Maritain and quoted Maritain extensively. If you added that list, so you add the Europeans and you start to add by 1970, the list of Catholic Christian Democratic politicians influenced by Maritain would include Eduardo Frei, the Prime Minister of Chile in the 60s, Rafael Caldera, the Prime Minister of Venezuela in the late 60s, even Pierre Trudeau of Canada. It did not include John F. Kennedy, another Catholic president or prime minister whose intellectual formation was innocent of Catholic social thought. But it did include his brother-in-law, Sergeant Schreiber, the first director of the Peace Corps and the War on Poverty, and included Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. It even included, that is, Catholic figures influenced by Maritain. It even included Joseph R. Biden Sr., father of a future U.S. president. Now, former President Biden has a penchant for loosely documented stories about his father, so it may not be true, as he told David Brooks, that his working-class father read Maritain in the 1950s. But even that misremembering, I think, the fact that Biden thought it was important to say that his father read Maritain is telling. Now, Maritain found vindication at the Second Vatican Council, in part because his old friend, Giovanni Montini, they were very close friends, their correspondence is extraordinary, had become Pope Paul VI. Paul VI guided the discussion of the final conciliar document, Gaudium et Spes, which sketched the importance of all citizens taking part in public affairs. Its impact was immense. If in the 1950s intellectuals wondered, can Catholics actually sustain democracy? They're authoritarians. How can they be democratic citizens? By the 1980s, scholars are marveling at the Catholic capacity to sustain democracy. This story is, I think, quite interesting. So here's John F. Kennedy with a young Prime Minister of Uganda, Benedicto Kiwanuka. Jonathan Earl and J.J. Carney have recently told this story. Kiwanuka was inspired by these Christian Democratic parties. He himself was Catholic. He was educated in London and the Netherlands. He came back to Uganda, took a leading role in political life there. He welcomed very openly and warmly the work of the Second Vatican Council. There's a tragic ending to this story. Under Idi Amin's leadership in Uganda, the country went into disarray. Catholics were never a particular target of Amin's wrath, but independent sources of power were, and Amin soon embarked on a campaign against foreign influence in Uganda in the early 1970s, a campaign that began with South Asians, but was extended to Catholics, especially priests, as pawns of a global church. Amin expelled 55 priests from the country and arranged for the kidnapping and murder of Kiwanuka, who was still playing a significant role in public life. In fact, we now think Amin himself pulled the trigger as Kiwanuka left morning mass. Outcomes in South Asia and East Asia were happier. This is Seoul's Stephen Cardinal Kim, who was appointed by Paul VI in 1968. He became the leader of the resistance movement against the South Korean government in the 1970s and 1980s. He had grown up in a very poor family, Kim, and spent a long time in West Germany ministering to Korean migrant miners and their families, where he became aware of Christian Democratic parties and more aware of Catholic social thought. He quoted relentlessly Gaudium et Spes during the Korean resistance movement, and he informed government leaders at the height of the crisis, where thousands of protesters were lodged inside the main cathedral in Seoul, that they would have to trample me first, priests second, and then sisters before giving up on our effort for democratic governance. In the Philippines, those two nuns there are in the Philippines during the people power movement in the 1980s, where Filipino Catholics, now the country, of course, is vastly majority Catholic, but explicitly Filipino Catholics take a lead in the resistance against the government. Millions of people in the streets during the people power revolution. A Filipino Jesuit, I would add, was the key drafter of the country's first democratic constitution, or really the first democratic constitution. And of course, the most dramatic events occurred in Eastern Europe. 6 months after his election in 1978, John Paul II returned to his native country. The crowds packing every event. 25% of the Polish population attended a mass in Poland led by Pope John in 8 days in 1979. This signaled not only a disenchantment with the communist regime, but the role of Catholicism in articulating demands for democratic governance. John Paul II did not cause the formation of the independent trade union Solidarity a year later, but the quote, awakened consciences of Polish workers, in the words of Timothy Garton Ash, stemmed in part from the papal visit. The Solidarity movement soon had 10 million members. It became the locus of resistance against the communist regime, and John Paul II helped fund and helped advise the leaders of the Solidarity movement. Again, the collapse of communist rule in Poland and Eastern Europe is a big, complex story. It probably rests most of all on Mikhail Gorbachev's unwillingness to send tanks to Prague and East Berlin and Warsaw. But the Catholic role in the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe was significant, maybe vital. As the Polish economy crumbled in the late 1980s, desperate communist leaders allowed the first free elections, and Catholics, and especially people formed by Solidarity, registered stunning triumphs. So you have this extraordinary phenomenon. In September 1989, even before the fall of the wall, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, friendly with John Paul since the 1950s, a close observer of the Second Vatican Council, the person who translates Gaudium et Spes into Polish, he becomes the first non-communist prime minister in Poland since before World War II. These triumphs, Catholics demanding democratic governments, and even, as with Kiwanuka in Uganda, becoming martyrs for that cause, these triumphs now seem as if from a different world. Isolated, inspiring figures, especially in China and Hong Kong, some of you know the story of Jimmy Lai, Catholic imprisoned by the Chinese Communist Party, cannot obscure a wider malaise. In Europe and South America, Christian and Democratic parties have gone into eclipse. In the heavily Catholic Philippines, a dictator, Rodrigo Duterte, for a time ran roughshod over the Constitution. In the United States, the most significant crisis since the 19th century, democratic crisis, envelops the country. A majority of Republican candidates, party candidates elected to the House in 2024, everyone knows this, denied the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election. In these hectic first few weeks of the administration, we may be lurching toward what sober-minded observers describe as a constitutional crisis over executive authority. The Catholic response to this current crisis, from bishops certainly, but also from intellectuals and other Catholic leaders, has been muted. Harvard professors Levitsky and Ziblatt, I showed you their book a second ago, complained to the New York Times a few months ago that Brazilian bishops had united against Bolsonaro and German bishops had united against the AfD. But why had American Catholic bishops and American Catholics not done more in the current crisis? I worry that the coming struggle over immigration in the context of possible mass deportation may become a test case. My own view is that many Catholics have forgotten what Maritain once taught them. In the 1970s, skepticism about democracy came from the left. Latin American liberation theologians, in moments of hubris, chided Maritain and leaders of Christian democratic parties for their conventional, naive reformism. Talk of democracy and human rights, in this view, only masked the need for radical economic reforms. Now, the greater threat to democracy comes from the populist right. Part of the story, which we could talk about in the question and answer period, is the intersection of the abortion issue with party politics in the United States. Part of the story, I think, is the distance of even Catholic intellectuals having fully absorbed contemporary identity politics from the actual concerns of working class voters, maybe even especially working class voters of color. Nothing could be further from Maritain's commitment to democratic practice. In 1941, bizarrely, when I read this, at the height of the crisis, Maritain's trying to organize Catholics in democracy and writing manifestos and writing to his friends in France and seeing his letters can get through. At the height of that, he takes 3 weeks and writes a scholarly essay on Machiavelli. Now, why would he do that? Because he wanted to stress the noble vocation of the politician in a democracy. He refused to denigrate politicians as Machiavellian. Now, in the 19th century, I've argued, enthusiasm for democracy in the public realm fed enthusiasm for democracy in the church. Now, the flow of ideas is reversed. Some of the same figures trampling on democratic norms in the public arena oppose the efforts of Pope Francis and others to develop modes of representation within the church. Stephen Bannon uses his podcast to promote conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, even as he takes potshots at Pope Francis. One of Francis's ecclesial antagonists, Archbishop Carlo Maria Vigano, the one-time Vatican nuncio to the United States, called on Francis to resign and then released a series of genuinely feverish and unhinged videos connecting the deep state, I have a phrase of President Trump, to the deep church. Francis has made synods central to his papacy, picking up a thread left dangling by Paul VI. In the early 19th century, again, to remember, Catholic reformers drafting some of the world's first constitutions thought about representation within the church, too. They wondered how lay people could be represented in church structures. That moment was derailed in the 19th century by the ultramontane style that I tried to describe very briefly, which was a brilliant moment in the history of Catholic piety, but it was not a moment concerned with representation. It was resuscitated at the Second Vatican Council, very loosely, the idea of synods, and now again it's taking more closer to center stage. National synods were recently done in Germany and Australia. Germans in particular have a long tradition of this. In the United States, about 1 million Catholics participated in the synod that occurred between 2023 and 2024. You could say, you'd be right, that this is a tiny percentage of American Catholics, about 1 million. But it's also 1 million more people who entered a room and talked about their hopes for the church than ever before. There was a massive synod in Rome that in 2023 and again in 2024 with participation from Catholics around the world. Francis, too, has been vocal in his support for democracy around the world, including a memorable speech in Athens, the birthplace of democracy. So what is this story about democracy and Catholicism? Where does it fit within the bigger picture of global history and global Catholicism? I love this quote. Pope Francis says, "We do not live in an era of change, but a change of era." We do not live in an era of change, but a change of era. The ground beneath political, diplomatic, ecological, academic, and ecclesiastical certainties is collapsing. The ground is collapsing. I say this, by the way, as a provost who will be in a meeting all day Sunday to talk about our budget and new federal funding guidelines and possible taxes. Certainly within the church, this is true. The ground is shifting. This afternoon, I have not even spoken about the other core themes of the book, including the rapid shift of gravity within Catholicism from the global north to the global south. 1/6 of the world's Catholics now live in Africa. Nigeria has as many Catholics in church on a given Sunday as all of Western Europe. I haven't discussed the sexual abuse crisis, which I treat in the book as an organic and tragic development of church structures that were built in the 19th century. In retrospect, and you can only see this in retrospect, there was a certain inevitability to it. My point again, Catholicism as an institution will be reinvented in the 21st century, much as it was in the 19th. We will live through that. We just don't know how it will be reinvented. And if my book, and perhaps this talk, provides a savvy baseline as the process of transformation unfolds, it will have served its purpose. Thank you.